Okay, so get ready to dive into something kind of wild. You ever heard of a cold water doctor?
Not sure I have.
Well, they were a thing. And today we're diving into their world with Dr. John Harvey Kellogg's 1876 book, The Uses of Water in Health and Disease. You might know Kellogg from his cereal, but this guy was way ahead of his time with this whole water cure thing.
It's true. And it wasn't just some Victorian fad. Kellogg's book talks about centuries of using water for health.
Yeah.
Like, it's really surprising how far back it goes.
Right. And Kellogg was a medical doctor, so he tried to bring some science to it. He gets deep into how our skin works, like really deep, because he saw it as this major detox organ.
Yeah, that's key to understanding why water therapies were such a big deal back then.
You're
Kellogg was all about how the skin eliminates waste, and if that process gets messed up, it can impact your whole system.
He even describes the buildup on unwashed skin as a varnish-like coating.
Okay, you.
I know, right? But it makes sense. He also talks about these microscopic mites that live on everyone's skin. They're called Demodex follicularum.
Wait, everyone has skin mites?
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah.
They're harmless, but still makes you think about how ideas about hygiene have changed, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Like, what seems normal now could have been unheard of back then.
Exactly. Kellogg contrasts different cultures' approaches to bathing, like how the ancient Romans were all about those public baths.
Right, and some Native American cultures use sweat lodges for purification.
But then you have Europe in the Middle Ages, where full immersion baths were like a once in a blue moon kind of thing.
For like 1,000 years, it's wild.
I know, right? Talking about a long bath. But it shows how ideas about hygiene are always changing.
For sure. They're tied to so many things: culture, religion, even economics.
Totally. And that's what's interesting about Kellogg. He recognized the extremes on both sides. He called out the cold water extremists, but also the doctors who were way too into intense treatments.
Yeah, like bloodletting.
Exactly. Things that seem crazy now.
Kellogg saw water cures as a gentler alternative, but he wasn't like, water solves everything. He knew it had limitations.
He wanted a balanced approach, using water alongside other treatments and tailoring it to each person.
Which makes a lot of sense.
Right. It's refreshing to hear that from a 19th century doctor.
Totally. It reminds us that even people promoting alternative medicine back then weren't always anti-establishment. They just wanted better options.
So ready to dive into the actual water cures.
Let's do it.
Okay, so Kellogg breaks down all these different baths, categorized by temperature, and get this, he's got cold, cool, temperate, tepid, warm, and hot.
Wow, that's specific.
Right, like how do you even measure tepid back then?
Good point. Thermometers weren't exactly standard household items in the 1800s.
Exactly. But it shows how important temperature was to these treatments. Kellogg believed different temperatures could create different effects in the body. So are you ready to hear about some of these baths?
Hit me with it.
Okay, this one sounds kind of wild. It's called the wet sheet pack. Literally wrapping someone up in a wet sheet.
I mean, it sounds logical for, like, cooling someone down, but a whole treatment.
Right. But Kellogg's not talking about just dunking a sheet in water. He says you got to wring it out first, then wrap the person up, and then pile on blankets for warmth.
Okay, so it's more like a wet sheet burrito.
Basically. And he claims it's amazing for relaxation and sweating out toxins.
Interesting.
Then there's the shower pack, which he recommends for fevers, though it sounds a bit intense.
Oh.
How so?
Well, you wrap the person in wet sheets, again with the wet sheets, but then you pour cool water over them to bring down their temperature quickly.
Ah, I see. Makes sense considering fevers were a much bigger deal back then without modern medicine.
Totally.
What else you got?
Okay, how about this one? The cataract douche. It sounds kind of epic, like something out of a movie.
A cataract douche. What is that?
Picture this. You're standing there and suddenly, bam, a controlled waterfall of water pours down on you.
Whoa. Intense.
I know, right? And Kellogg says you could adjust the height and temperature for different effects. He thought it was super invigorating, I bet. Though I imagine it wouldn't be for everyone.
Yeah, some people would probably find it terrifying.
Exactly. And that brings up a good point. Kellogg wasn't saying everyone should just jump into the most intense water cure.
Right. He was all about moderation and figuring out what worked for each person.
He always stressed that these treatments weren't one size fits all.
Totally. And it's not all about these intense baths either. Kellogg also talks about simpler uses of water, like drinking enough of it, especially for constipation. And he even gives instructions on making a DIY water filter.
Oh, interesting. What's the deal with the water filter?
Well, clean water wasn't always a guarantee back then, so having a way to purify it at home was a big deal.
That makes sense.
It shows how much importance he placed on having access to clean, pure water for health, something we often take for granted today.
Totally. It's easy to forget that something so basic to us now was a much bigger concern back then.
For sure. But you know what's really cool about all this? Kellogg wasn't just throwing out random water treatments. He wanted people to understand why these things might work.
Yeah, he emphasized understanding the why behind the treatments. He was all about individualizing them, too.
Right. Like I was saying earlier, it's almost like he was a health coach in a way.
Totally. He wanted people to understand their own bodies and how water could help them specifically.
And he even adjusted his recommendations based on whether it was for men, women, children, or older
It
folks.
makes sense, though, right? Because what
Yeah.
works for one person might not work for another. It's
Mm,
the same with any therapy, really.
definitely. It's just interesting to see that approach laid out so clearly back in the 1800s.
It's a good reminder for us now, too. Just because something is natural like water doesn't mean it's always 100% safe or risk-free.
That's true. It's like anything else. You got to know what you're doing.
Exactly. And it's always best to err on the side of caution and talk to a medical professional before you try anything new, especially something this involved.
For sure. So after this deep dive into Kellogg's water cure world, any final thoughts? What's sticking with you?
Honestly, it's just amazing how much people were able to do with just water. Some of it might seem a little out there now, but back then it was cutting-edge stuff.
I know, right? They didn't have all the fancy technology and medications we have now, so they had to get creative.
Exactly. And it makes you appreciate the ingenuity and resourcefulness of these early health pioneers. Even if some of their methods seem a little strange to us now, they were really onto something with the power of water.
Totally. And hey, maybe this has inspired some of our listeners to think twice the next time they take a bath or even just pour themselves a glass of water.
I hope so. It's always good to have a little historical perspective, right?
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the fascinating world of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg and his water cures.
Until next time.